Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David Rooney, publisher of the Revelstoke Current, and welcome to In Conversation, our periodic discussion of all things political. And today I have the new federal Liberal candidate for Kootenay-Columbia riding, Don Johnston. Don, welcome to In Conversations.
Thank you very much for having me, David. I appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure. And you're a little different because you're from Nelson, and Nelson is, for the first time, for those of you who don't know, Nelson is now part of our riding, or will be as of voting day in October. So we have not only a new Liberal candidate, but he's from a new city to our riding, being added to our riding. And Don comes to us with a fairly interesting background. You're a Nelson boy.
I am a Nelson boy. I grew up in Nelson, went to all of my schooling there at Hume Elementary to Trafalgar, and graduated from L.V. Rogers High School. Did my first year of university there, actually, because Notre Dame University was still open in those days. And it was a tremendous asset to the community, and a bit of a tragedy when it closed not that many years later. But it was an incredible community to grow up in. I was lucky enough years later to be able to bring my daughter back to grow up there, and she also graduated from the same high school, and that's rare today with the mobility that we have, so it was a wonderful opportunity.
Well, the communities the size of Nelson and Revelstoke, it's more likely going to happen there than, say, Toronto or Montreal, both cities that you're familiar with, as well as Ottawa. Tell me a bit about your background other than Nelson. Now, you've worked primarily in the nonprofit sector. You've also worked for the federal government, and I think most importantly, as far as our viewers and voters in this riding are concerned, Don was also the first chief executive officer for the Columbia Basin Trust, and anybody who's lived here for any length of time knows about CBT. Tell us a bit about your professional background and what you've been doing in the last 20 years.
Well, when I left Nelson, I went off to UBC and quickly discovered that what drove me and my passion was working with communities and trying to find a way to make a difference, and making a difference in the broadest sense of that expression. Working with community organizations, supporting community capacity, doing a lot of work, as you said, with the federal government. I was involved in job creation programs in northern BC as a district manager for northern BC and the Yukon, actually, which was an incredible experience. I went on to do a lot of work with youth organizations like Kootenay-Columbia and Canada World Youth. Then went on and became involved in philanthropy with the Vancouver Foundation, where I worked for a number of years. During that period of time, Vancouver Foundation was actively involved in working with the Columbia Basin Trust to help them design and get up and moving with the programs, many of which are still at CBT. And that's how I connected first to the Columbia Basin Trust, was because I was working in philanthropy with Vancouver Foundation. And when they decided that they needed to hire a new CEO, and for me it was a chance to come back home and to bring my daughter, who was in grade 5 at that time, back to this part of the world to grow up, I jumped at the chance. And it was an exciting time. I was there 6 years, and it was the beginning. It was the growth period. It was the growing pains. It was the reaching out and establishing connections with all parts of this basin. And it was about beginning the process that we're now sort of seeing the fruit of trying to create the notion of a basin culture, and a notion that, although it's incredibly diverse, this region, and each community is unique, it's not an east-west kind of divide, it's much more subtle and complex than that. There is the beginning of a basin culture, and people are starting to understand that they have shared concerns, shared values. We just need to look out the window to see that. We just need to go on a hike to understand why we all live here. But there is also a real commonality of issues that we all need to think about as rural communities. So that job was an incredible opportunity to get to know this entire region in a way that 6 years of travel will do for you.
Tell me, the basin has changed since you first joined the CBT. What are the most important changes that you recognize? You mentioned the growth, the initiation and growth of basin culture. What else have you noticed here?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you look at where some of the sort of investment and growth went going back to when I was first with the Trust, there was an incredible focus on creating more tourism infrastructure, and speaking particularly of things like ski hills and golf courses, which everybody thought was maybe the panacea to some of the issues around economic development and growth. What we found out is that that's not in itself very sustainable over time, and now we're having golf courses with challenging to get enough golfers. There's certainly been issues with some of the ski hills. There's been issues with weather and climate in terms of how that's impacting those industries. And so we've watched sort of periods of growth and high activity followed by sort of consolidation and understanding that we still don't have the mix quite right. And we need to think about where else we need to go with economic diversification. And we still have incredible challenges from transportation and infrastructure perspective. Those haven't changed. We're isolated. You less so than some other parts
Really?
of the riding, because you're on the Trans-Canada.
Well, that's true.
You know,
Yeah.
although going on the Trans-Canada isn't necessarily a pleasant experience, you are connected. So there are other communities that feel much more isolated even than this. But as a region, except for the very close parts that are, you know, almost annexed to Alberta in some psychological ways, it's an isolated region, and we'll always face those challenges.
Now, after leaving the CBT, now that was about...
That was in 2005.
Yeah, I was going to say 2006-ish, but yeah, 2005, so a decade ago. What have you been doing in the last 10 years?
Well, I did some consulting for a while after I left CBT, some here. Did a lot of stuff actually with IHA around health service delivery, and more on the side of community engagement programs, outreach programs around issues like chronic care and health, in terms of working with populations with chronic health problems, but getting them to take responsibility and working with communities to do everything, some sort of mall walks in the winter so that they could actually go to a space where they could walk safely in the winter, and bringing the community into the healthcare continuum in terms of helping seniors create spaces where they could do those sorts of things. Then I went on to Canada World Youth, an organization I had worked for the entire decade of the 1980s, and I went back 17 years later as president and CEO. Canada World Youth is an organization very dear to my heart. First of all, because I love working with young people, but secondarily, the impact that it had around the world in terms of the relationships it built and the image of Canada that it built, and what the experience for the young people that went through the program. And it was a bilateral program, so we had Indonesians coming here and Canadians going to Indonesia. It wasn't Canadians going out doing volunteer work. It was groups of young people from different countries coming together, learning about one another, learning about what development really is at a human level. And powerful, powerful experience, and one that I was very, very happy to be involved with. It's the kind of program that engages people across the spectrum. When I was president of Canada World Youth, Alexandra Trudeau was the chair of the board of directors, and so I worked very closely with Alexandra, who understood very well the mission of the individual that started that program. That's Senator Jacques Hébert, who, as you know from his stand in Parliament around the abolition of Kootenay-Columbia, cared very, very deeply about youth issues. After I left Canada World Youth, I went to another job in the international volunteer sector with Canadian Executive Services Organization, used to be Canadian Executive Services Overseas, a program that sends senior business executives, mostly retired or at least semi-retired, to go on assignments overseas to work with the business community there, because at the end of the day in the development spectrum, unless you start creating local economic activity and jobs, you never get off the dependency cycle, right?
That's
so
right.
There's some point at which you have to put money into creating a different kind of economic reality for people that are living there. So we had senior executives that would do everything from go to cooperative bakeries and walk the bakery floor and look at the production methods and the ways of increasing production in terms of efficiencies, in terms of those level deals. And we had people that would go down into the Caribbean and work with the regional organizations to look at trade treaties and how they could use the trade treaties to better increase their participation in export programs, particularly around foodstuffs and things like that. Right from understanding the treaty and the opportunities it gave them right through to the production and labeling of the products so that they would meet the standards in North American markets. Incredible range of things, putting quinoa plants through the iOS certification process so that they had the highest standards of manufacturing, which again made their products viable in any market, the European market. So just an incredible range of things, and these incredible people who had a good deal of success in life and were still willing to go and spend weeks and months in developing countries working with the people in a hands-on way. Really incredibly interesting. The other thing Canadian Executive Services Organization did was a lot of work with First Nations communities within Canada. Again, mostly in the business development end of things, helping people set up and get businesses established and operational, and once again, everything from business planning to how do you create a marketing program to how do you put together a package to get the financing, all of that sort of stuff. So it had that sort of domestic element and that international element. And my career's been pretty much 50-50, 50% working internationally and 50% working on programs in Canada. And we were in Toronto for that period of time. So I have a pretty good sense of this country from those experiences.
How have those experiences informed your political decision? Because you haven't been involved in partisan politics in the past. Although you did work for government, that's not the same thing. How has your background informed your decision to run for the Federal Liberal Party?
Well, I think it's informed my decision to run for the Federal Liberal Party because as I look at the current political situation, one of the big personal concerns I have is how far away we've gotten from the notion of what the intent of our political system is and why the position of Member of Parliament was created in the first place. I mean, the reality is the role of the MP is to represent this riding in Ottawa. That was the intent. That's how they built it. Made sense in a simpler time, but it's become very complex and I think very removed from people's considerations when they think about what they want to do within the current system. I also think that this riding is not getting the kind of representation that it deserves, and I think that's because of the central control nature of this particular government. And certainly I've heard comments made in this riding about the inability of one MP to be able to do very much from a small part of the country. My own sense is that my entire history, my entire working history has been underpinned by an understanding that change only ever happens when one or two or another small group of people get involved and start things to happen. And I will never accept, ever, that one MP doesn't have a contribution to make and can't create incremental changes. And again, when I look at the region, and because I spent 6 years traveling this region, I've been literally to every corner of this riding. I see the kind of stresses that rural communities are under. Again, we are an urban nation and becoming more so all the time. 70% of people in BC live in urban environments, higher percentages of that in Eastern Canada, particularly in Ontario. And we need to surface the issues facing rural communities in a more comprehensive way. And I feel the MP has a real opportunity by getting to know the issues in the region on a broad basis. In this trip that I've been making, I've met every mayor in every town, partly out of protocol, because they are the the elected leaders in that area, but more importantly to try to understand their perspective on what these issues are and to find the commonalities. And I think part of the message that I would take back to Ottawa is the unique situations of rural communities, and I would reach out to other MPs from other rural areas regardless of party affiliation and try to begin a dialogue around getting rural issues more profile in Ottawa, and also to then work closely with groups that are already doing things here and coordinate the liberal efforts and the government's efforts with people that are already doing things here, and not try to create programs to help in isolation from what's actually going on here, but rather to understand where the federal government can actually play an active role and a useful role.
One of the things I'm interested in, and I've asked other candidates this is the same question as well, is how do you motivate young people to get involved in the political process? How do you get them to get out there and vote? I mean, when you and I were kids, and I'm guessing we're about the same age, when 18 rolled around, that opportunity to vote in any kind of election was a big deal, and I've always exercised that franchise. I'm going to guess that you have too, and yet whenever I talk to my sons, and they're in their 30s now, I get a sense that they don't really feel as though they've been empowered, regardless of the messages that I've given them, the teachings I've given them. I don't get the sense that they're empowered or feel empowered, and a lot of younger people here in Revelstoke have the same sensation, even though this is a really child and youth-oriented community. We do a lot to ensure that our young people are safe, are well educated, and have opportunities to do things that they don't have in Toronto or Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get out there and reach people, reach the younger generation? Now you may have some new ideas because you've been involved with youth at different levels. What do you bring to the table?
I mean, first of all, I agree with the premise of your investigation that young people have become really disconnected from the political process, and I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to that than we are, because we're creating a situation where our democracy weakens the more we have those people withdraw. What's going to happen 10 years when you and I can't make it to the polls anymore? Certainly I've voted in every election of every level of government that I've had the right to be voting in, and I think that's really critical. One of the challenges is that a lot of political parties are not prepared to put the time and energy in to connect to youth, because the risk is that you put that time and energy in there and you don't get them out anyway. On voting day, they have a beer too many the night before, or something else is going on, and they just decide that it's not important enough. Again, I think that's short-sighted. I think you have to make that effort and you have to try to engage them. Certainly we're going to be looking at some interesting ways to use social media to reach that group. We certainly saw, for instance, in Calgary, where Mayor Nenshi came from sort of out of nowhere, but he did part of that effectively through using social media, and the type of messaging was a different kind of messaging. It was more positive. It was more inclusive in terms of inviting people in, and I think that's part of the answer there. I think the other part of the answer is to take the time to identify youth leaders in communities, which we're in the process of doing and have had some luck in some communities, treating them as equals and asking them to get involved and to try to rally people. My experience is a little different because my daughter's a political science and development studies major, so she's very gung-ho, and she's always Facebooking her friends and telling them how to get registered for voting. She's been in constant contact with her friends here in this riding to tell them that her daddy's running and that it's time for them to get involved because they have somebody they know. I mean, I don't think it's easy, but I think you have to decide it's a priority, and for this campaign it is a priority, and you have to start the same way we start with everyone, one or two at a time, and keep building on that and keep paying attention, because they're not voting is a choice about what kind of government we're going to have, and we have to make people realize that by not voting they're also making a choice, and it's probably not a choice that's consistent with their best interests.
Or, truth be told, the values they claim to hold.
That's right. That's right. And that's another, that's another issue. I mean, clearly one of the big issues in this election, in every election from now till the end of time, is the environment and starting to recognize that we have to think differently moving forward, and we need to first of all, as a country, we need to re-engage in the dialogue around climate change and global warming and all of those sorts of things. And certainly the Liberal Party would do that in a big way. We need to be active participants in Paris in the fall. We need to engage with the provinces who in this country right now are leading the change in terms of environmental policy, in terms of understanding the need to put a price on carbon, understanding the need to begin thinking of green technologies now. Are we carbon dependent right now? Pretty clearly. And for people that say we will be for a long time and or forever, the only way that begins to change is we begin to take a comprehensive look at what some of those opportunities are, and I think there's economic opportunities too. That's an issue that resonates with youth, but they're not seeing government take any action on that. In fact, they're seeing budget documents where the environment gets mentioned 2 times and energy and oil gets mentioned 80 times. So there's that disconnect, and I think we have to find some of those issues that are compelling for young people.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell on the whole carbon-based fuel issue very much, but I think our society's thinking along those lines really has to evolve. I mean, when you talk about fossil fuels and what they're used for, people always think their car. The trucks passing them on the highway or a plane, but a significant percentage of all oil that's pumped today goes into plastics, and how ubiquitous are plastics?
Yeah.
To the point where, that's, I think plastics are a bigger problem than the fuel that we burn. Look at something like the North Pacific Gyre, and try it down any highway in the country, and you're going to see plastic bags flapping in the wind somewhere. They're a major issue, and we don't even look at plastics. We don't even think about them because we're so used to them. They're below the radar. But that's just an observation I wanted to make.
Well, and just an interesting point about that, though, because we have been living in Toronto, or we had been living in Toronto. We've been back for 4 years now. In terms of the supermarkets and stores back there, there's a number of cities now that have got some pretty strong legislation around the use of plastic containers and plastic bags, and in some stores you can't even get them anymore, and then the ones where you can, you pay a fee so that they can go into recycling. So there's an awareness beginning to grow. It's nowhere near as large as it needs to, and I don't think people understand the range of products that you're talking about. So yeah, I agree with you, but at least we're beginning to see some movement there.
Yeah.
Small,
but it's happening. Everything starts with a seed.
Everything's incremental, and that's one of the things. If you're going to go into this role that I'm sitting here talking to you about today, I'm not naive enough to think that we're going to change the world in a short period of time. I've been around a little too long and been working in some fairly difficult areas in the world. We did a lot of work in Haiti after the earthquake at Canadian Executive Services Organization, and I visited it a couple of times. And it is really incremental steps. But if you don't believe that incrementality matters over time, and you're not prepared to continue to work and be satisfied with seeing the markers move a little bit at a time, you're going to drive yourself crazy. But you're also going to back away, and then the change never gets to where you would like it to get. It's just a question of remaining focused and believing that we can do things differently in many areas. The other issue with young people that I think is really, really important, and I think it's much broader than just young people, and that is the sense that a lot of Canadians have that their votes don't really matter. That under the first past the post system, you have situations where somebody that got a minority of the vote becomes the undisputed representative of that region, speaking at a riding level now, and then of course that translates up to the higher levels. And I think it's incumbent on us as a country, if we want to protect our democracy and protect the sense of ownership that Canadians have around being participants in the democratic process, we have to look at alternatives. And the Liberal Party is committed, if they form government, to convening a process involving all parties, an all-party process, including expert voices from outside and a public process, to begin to look at what some of those alternatives. Because when the faith and trust that your participation matters starts to fall apart, it becomes pretty unsustainable. And I don't know how we ever get those young people back.
Well, that's a tough issue, and for a couple of reasons. I think I've been through this discussion a couple of times here in BC, and part of the problem is when you talk about alternatives, everybody understands first past the post. There's no question. Everybody in Canada understands that. Once you talk about proportional representation, your eyes start to glaze over, because no ordinary citizen understands it.
Yeah.
And that makes it a tough sell. That's why it failed in the referendum. And the other thing is that it's a constitutional issue, and opening up the Constitution at any time is a major gamble for the party in power, or for any party.
Yeah.
Because suddenly, if you're going to talk about reforming the way we elect our MPs, then you talk about the Senate. Senate reform. There will be people who will say, well, we want we want 3 or 4 senators, and PEI should only have 1, and can't be Mike Duffy, so on and so forth. It never ends, and that becomes a real political problem, which is why most governments will say, well, yes, we're interested. The Conservatives in particular have said, they're interested in Senate reform, but they don't want to actually do it because of what it signifies.
Right. I think the issues related to the voting process we use are a little simpler to solve than the Senate ones. There's no question that kind of a conversation happens at a level above the basic interests of average Canadians. But I do think the level of frustration with the first past the post system has grown a lot since then. I mean, I was quite shocked with the results in the BC referendum, quite disappointed. But I tend to be overly optimistic sometimes. But it's not a simple process, but if we don't start that conversation, once again, then we're left with what we have. And if what we have is not satisfying the needs, and it's creating a situation of decreasing the involvement, lower numbers of people voting, and we haven't found a way to re-engage young people coming into the system, then pretty soon, the percentage of people that's actually going to choose who runs this country shrinks to the point where it's no longer a very democratic reality. The NDP have come out with a declaration that they will have a proportional representation system in place for the next election. That's an interesting thing to say, but there's been no discussion about how we get there, how that process gets there, and I think it's too big a decision to take without serious involvement and engagement of all kinds of partners in that conversation, and I don't think it'll fly in that way. But I fundamentally believe we have to begin that conversation, because every change starts with with one step. And if we look at other issues like the carbon issue, we've heard the Prime Minister say things like putting a price on carbon would be an idiotic idea in the current climate economically in terms of the price of oil and things like that. I think there's a counter argument that says if we don't start paying attention to that, the economic consequences of not beginning to understand that we have to find ways to disengage from that as the only or the primary fuel source are bigger in the long term. We're already dealing with it with some of the catastrophic events that are happening because of climate change. So none of these are easy issues, and we can't pretend they're easy issues, but even the most difficult issues get solved only after people begin to talk about them, people begin to educate themselves about them, and people begin to understand that there are actually alternatives.
Okay. Well, you're a guy who's kind of obviously given some thought to many of these issues. This is going to be an interesting campaign, I think, in particular, if you can energize, help energize the electorate and get people thinking about ideas, because all too often people line up along ideological lines, partisan lines, and they vote that way without really thinking about the consequences of their votes. Doesn't matter whether it's for the Conservatives, the NDP, the Greens, or for the Liberals. They don't really think about what's going to happen. So it'll be interesting if you can keep the conversation going in the coming months. And we have, 4 or 5 months until the election, so we've got plenty of time to talk.
I do have lots of time to talk and a big area to talk in. As you know, we're sort of 3/4 of the way through our first tour of the riding, and I was only nominated on the 27th of May. We plan to do 2 more full tours before the writ is dropped, and then once the writ's dropped, I'm not going to know where I'm sleeping on a given night when I get up in the morning probably. Now, where am I? Because those conversations have to happen with people in communities, so we're going to be out and we're going to be around and we're going to be talking to a lot of people. The reality in this riding is for the Liberal Party to win the seat, which I truly believe we can do that, or I wouldn't be doing this. This is a fairly major commitment that political candidates make. Is we're going to have to make inroads in every community in this region, and we have to have sort of direct dialogue with as many people as we can possibly have that direct dialogue with, and get them to think of a different way of understanding what their vote means. And what their vote primarily means, again, is finding somebody that can and will represent the issues of this riding in Ottawa, and do so with confidence and with energy and passion. And the 6 years that I spent as CEO of the Columbia Basin Trust, and the opportunities it gave me to work with people all around this incredible part of the world that we all love so dearly, gives me, I think, a broad understanding of the region that very few people are lucky enough to have. And my entire life has been spent, I couldn't have done the work that I've done and been at all effective at it if I didn't believe passionately in the cause, and in the need for change, and the reality that you can cause change. Change starts in communities like Revelstoke and Nelson and Golden and Fernie. It's not an abstract thing, it's people coming together, talking, and agreeing we want something different.
Terrific. Don Johnston, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that brings us to a close of this edition of In Conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. Talk to you again soon. That's it.